Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Organizational Preparedness Training and Introduction to Community and Faith-Based Organizations. This is a part of our National Preparedness Month webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and sent out to all the participants along with other supporting documents, and we can include the links that I put in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties or have any questions as we go along, please put them into the chat and I will be happy to answer them along the way. Usually we do this training with 2 people, but because we're stretched thin with Ida, I will be doing it solo today. So I encourage everyone to participate so that you don't have to hear me talk for a whole hour. So first, I want to introduce myself. My name is Sam Lawson. I'm a community engagement specialist at New York City Emergency Management. And my area of focus is people with disabilities and the organizations that serve them. One second. Sorry about that, folks. So again, like I said, I'll be sending out the slides along with a recording of the presentation. Our agenda for today. So first, we're going to just talk about what does New York City Emergency Management do. I'm thankful to see a lot of returning people who we know well on the call today. But just for those of you who might not be as familiar with our organization, that's where we'll start. We will talk about personal preparedness. It's not the focus, but we'll just touch on it. We'll talk a little bit about community emergency planning at the end, but of course the meat of our discussion will be organizational preparedness. And we'll do a little practice session to just get us acquainted with some of the concepts that we talk about. Thanks everyone who put their names into the chat. That's really helpful to know who is on the webinar today. Something else I'd like to note is that we have a guide that goes along with this training that everyone will get afterwards that goes through each slide in more depth, and you can use that to create a plan for your organization. One thing I like to note at the beginning is that the goal of this presentation, one second. There we go. Can someone just write in the chat that they can see the agenda slide? Okay. So one thing I like to note at the top of this presentation, especially because I see a lot of people who are actively, thank you for that. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. So I think now you should be able to see the agenda slide. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So one thing I like to note at the top of this training is that the goal is this is more of an awareness training. There are organizational preparedness trainings that last for days and are really in depth. This is more of a short training to get everyone familiar with the concept. I also see a lot of people who are actively responding to IDA, so that is something I'll address during the training. So to begin, we're going to talk about what does New York City Emergency Management do? And before I do that, I want to talk about what we're doing right now. So the post-storm response to IDA is, of course, what we're doing right now. I know a lot of you are actively engaged in this. This is something that we put together just to show what the agency and the city as a whole has been doing. Of course, we've been coordinating these efforts. As of the 19th, we have assisted 3,200 people in our service centers. So there's currently service centers for those affected by Ida open in the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. All of the city's resources can be found at nyc.gov/IDA, which I just put into the chat. And that has all of the resources offered at the center. Those resources can be accessed online. And so you can either point people towards that website, or I know if you're spreading the word in your community, you can point people towards going to the center. In addition to that, the city's Emergency Operations Center remains open, and we are distributing meals and providing a lot of other services. The big update, of course, is that FEMA declared that the president declared issued a major disaster declaration, which means that in the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, individual assistance is available. So people could potentially be reimbursed for some of the damages caused by Ida. And in Manhattan and all the other boroughs, public assistance is available, which means that an organization like yours could potentially also be reimbursed for any damages you sustain or any response you do to Ida. We're going to touch on that briefly, but I do want to mention that that's happening right now. Something else to note is that every time I've given this presentation, a different emergency has been happening actively. And that just goes to show why this is important. Your organization will go through many emergencies over the course of your emergency plan. And so that's really why we're here today, is to talk about how to get prepared for the next thing that happens. So who we are, I know a lot of you are familiar with us, but New York City Emergency Management helps New Yorkers before, during, and after emergencies through preparedness, education, and response. And these are just some photos of what we do every day. The top left is a photo of the Emergency Operations Center. As I said, it's active right now, responding to Ida. The top right is we go out into the field and help New Yorkers after emergencies, big or small. It could be a house fire or a pandemic. We will be out in the field responding actively. The bottom right, we have a photo of our community engagement activities. So like we're doing now for National Preparedness Month, we go out and give presentations. And then finally on the bottom left, we have staff here 24/7 who issue emergency alerts, which you can get on your phone. And we'll talk about how you can get emergency alerts for your organization. I like to start with personal preparedness in this presentation because if your employees are not prepared for an emergency, they will not come to work. And so a good way to start is to start with personal preparedness. We say it just takes 3 simple steps: make a plan, gather supplies, and stay informed. This is a presentation we can do for your staff or clients for free. We can also have our CERT members, who I know we have some of them on the webinar today, can also provide this to your organization. And so we're happy to do this. It's not the focus of what we're talking about today, but we would really like to be a resource. And you can find out at nyc.gov/edreadyny. And there you can request us to give a presentation or attend any events that your organization does. But again, if your employees are not prepared, then they will not work when the time comes. And so we always say it's good to start with personal preparedness when you are getting your organization prepared. So first I wanted to start with an icebreaker, which is you can either raise your hand or write in the chat. So share your thoughts. A crisis for my organization is when we are unable to provide blank services to who. So the first blank is which services, you're unable to provide, and the second one is who you're unable to provide them to. So just take a moment and write in the chat or raise your hand to answer a crisis for my organization is when we are unable to provide blank services to blank. Great. First, we have housing services to tenants. So when you're unable to provide those housing services, and then we have those in our community who are most at risk. And that is a great point that we're going to come to you again and again throughout this presentation. So food in the food pantry to people who are in need. And I think we're sensing a theme of a crisis for my organization is when we are unable to provide our services, whether that be food or housing or religious, spiritual care, to people who are most in need, including we have people suffering mental illness, people who face housing insecurity or food insecurity. And that's a good place to start. So something that we're going to keep thinking about throughout this presentation is how can you be able to provide those services people depend on, and especially the people who need them the most. So what is organizational preparedness? You may have heard the term COOP, C-O-O-P, or continuity of operations or emergency planning. Those are all the same concept that we're talking about here today. And what it is an effort in an organization to ensure that you can continue to provide services following an emergency. So like we said, you would define which services are the most important. And also you are defining what an emergency is for you. But the idea is that when there's a shock that happens, you would be prepared to keep providing your services afterwards. So in our next section, we're going to talk about organizational preparedness. Again, this is the meat of the presentation, which is how can you actually do this in your organization? And we're going to talk about the 3 steps to get your organization ready, what to expect during and after an emergency, and how to manage volunteers and donations. Finally, we'll talk about disaster recovery grant management, but mostly we're going to talk about the 3 steps to getting prepared. One thing I want to touch on too is the, of course, cycle of emergencies. The idea is that you want to prepare so that when you respond, you will recover more quickly. So right now, of course, we are in a response to recovery from Ida. A lot of organizations across the city are in that posture, including ours. And then in the long term, what you can do is minimize the effects and then get prepared for the next shock. So the 3 steps that we're talking about today are prioritizing your services. We've already started to do that a little bit, but we're going to go more in depth. Reducing the impact. So how do you reduce the impact of something happening before it happens? And then last, creating a plan so that you know what you're going to do before an emergency strikes. Next, we have prioritizing services. This is one of the most important steps because this really directs where the rest of your emergency plan is going to go. Before I go into it, does anyone want to just write in the chat, what is the most important service that your organization provides? What is the service that you could not continue to function as an organization if you were not doing? So we have counseling, direct human services, facilitating communication and service coordination among East Harlem organizations. Some others we heard before were, again, mental health services, distributing food. Some other ones that we heard were housing services. And again, I know I've seen we have a few faith-based organizations here that operate congregations across the city. And so for you, your most critical service might be the actual service that you're providing, of course, bringing people together. And so the first step in making an emergency plan is to assess your programs and figuring out which ones are the most critical. So I know some of your organizations, let's say you might provide, let's say, food distribution and also counseling and also help with accessing government services. And so for organizations that provide a lot of services, it's important to identify which ones are the most critical in an emergency so that you can basically begin to recover, starting with the most critical. And then things that can wait, or you could continue to function without doing them, those you would put off until later so that you can get back and running as quickly as possible to help the people who are most in need. Once you identify which services are the most important, then you can begin to outline steps to complete each task. And what that means is basically what resources do we need to have to keep operating that function. An example would be food. So we've talked about food distribution. We've done this presentation a few times for the food bank. So this is something I've thought about a lot, which is, for example, if your most important function is keeping our food bank running, then you would outline the steps it would take to keep it running. For example, the resources you would need, which is how will you get food there? How will you get electricity? How would you get your staff there? So starting to think about what do we need to do and what do we need to have in place to ensure that that critical service can continue to run. The fourth bullet on this page is establishing a recovery time frame, and what that means is how long will it take to get something back up and running. So for example, if there was some sort of emergency that stopped your ability to provide your critical service, how long would it take you to get back up and running so that you could start to provide that service again? And this will help you because let's say if there's an emergency, for example, let's say a flood like we just had, how long would it take you to be able to begin operating again. This, of course, is an estimate because you can't predict the future, but it sets for your organization, we would like to be back up and running, let's say in 2 or 3 days. And so the first step, prioritizing services as a whole, includes basically getting your leadership team together to assess which programs and services are the most critical for you to get back up and running, outlining the steps of things you would need to complete that task, and then establish a time frame that you would like to um, get back up and running. I got a question, so I do want to just make sure. Can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. Does anyone have a service that they would like to offer, maybe as an example of how to prioritize your services? I'm going to take another example from our list here, which one was, let's say, mental health services or counseling. So for example, if that is your most important service and you've identified with your team that that is the most critical service that we offer, then you would outline which steps you would need to continue to provide that. For example, if you needed access to patient records to do that, that's something you would identify. We would need to have patient records back up and running. And then you would identify how you could make that happen and how long you think that would take. Same thing with staffing. So to continue to do counseling services, we would need to have a certain number of staff. And then you would estimate how long you think that that would take. Once you have identified which services are the most critical, the next step is to identify the order of succession of people in your organization. I know a lot of your organizations rely on volunteers to keep going from day to day. And so if you have that one person who does everything, which I know a lot of our organizations do, you really have to identify before an emergency happens, who is going to take over the operation. So for example, I know we have Stephen Raga from Woodside on the Move on the call. If he was unable to report to work because something happened to him, if he was a victim of an emergency, for example, then you would want to identify who your successor is because you want someone to be able to make those decisions. For a lot of us, it might be hard to identify that second person, but it's really important because if it's all on one person, if only one person knows your emergency plan, then it's not going to be very effective. And so in your organization, what you would do is identify which positions are essential, and then you would basically identify who could be the backup if that person wasn't able to perform their duties. And that's an important part of an emergency plan. Oops, sorry. Now I want to turn a question back to you. What are some of the challenges that your organization faces in preparing for an emergency? So we have communication as one. Some other ones that you might be experiencing or that you might anticipate. What I've heard over and over again, oh, Mel, you took the words right out of my mouth, staffing. So staffing is one of the number one things that we hear from organizations. I know we have East Harlem Co-ed on the line. And in their last meeting, we talked all about staffing because during IDA, nobody could get to work the following day because of the transportation issues. And so staffing is one of the big problems around an emergency, especially for an organization that relies on volunteers. Something else that people might experience is leadership buy-in. So if you're not the leader of your organization, but you're in charge of the emergency planning, often it can get hard. It can be hard to convince leadership in a small organization that is very busy to focus on emergency planning. So getting your leadership to buy into this process is a really important part of emergency planning. And then last is funding. That's another thing that we hear over and over again. And one can be the funding to create an emergency plan. And also what often happens after an emergency is that organizations can become stretched thin or spend too much money responding to the emergency that they aren't able to continue to provide critical services afterwards. So this was just to highlight, again, some of the challenges you might want to think about as you're creating your emergency plan. Next, we're going to talk about knowing the hazards and reducing the impact. So my question for all of you is, what is the hazard that you are most worried about? So we have fire, excessive heat, water, flooding, fire, timely evacuation. So fire, of course, especially for our organizations, is the most common emergency in New York City. It's not the focus necessarily of this presentation, but it is something that happens to a lot of organizations and something you should be prepared for. Other things that happen, like photos on your screen, you'll see a blizzard, infrastructure collapse, power outages, flooding, and again, even something small like a car crashing into your building. It can be an emergency, but something that you should keep in mind is that emergency for your organization is not something that the city determines, right? And an emergency for your organization could be the loss of one person. It could be just a flood in your building. It could be really anything that you determine is an emergency. And so your emergency plan is about what your organization determines to be an emergency, and it is specific to you. Something to note too is that a lot of organizations, if you're a healthcare organization in particular, you've probably done this, do an assessment of which hazards are the most likely to impact their organization. We're not going to go in depth on this webinar on that, but it's something that we definitely encourage you to include in your emergency plan, which is which hazards are you the most likely to basically be affected by. Once you know which hazards are the most likely to affect your organization, and in our guide that we send you, we'll include some resources on that, then you can begin to create a plan to mitigate those risks. And some ways to do that would be through creating an emergency action plan. So this is the third step. And so some things that you should keep in your emergency action plan. The first, and we mentioned this earlier, Laura mentioned communication. Communication is often the hardest and most important thing for an organization in an emergency. And so what we recommend is, sorry about that, is to write a plan of how you will communicate after an emergency. This includes with staff, with volunteers, and with clients, and any other stakeholders like donors or members of your board, so that everyone knows what's happening, and so that when something happens, you will not be guessing of how you will communicate. We really recommend, of course, pre-written, pre-scripted messaging, especially about public safety, so that when something happens, you don't have to write a new message. You can just plug the pertinent information into your existing message to send out. And your organization could serve in the community as a person who sends safety messaging. We recommend that you sign up for our emergency alerts. I'll talk about how to do that at the end so that you can have a trusted source of emergency messaging. As a nonprofit, you can serve as a trusted voice in the community, but it's really important not to spread rumors or information that isn't verified. So we do recommend using official sources of information when you send out your communication. But in your emergency plan, you should include where you'll get information, how you'll send it out. And it's important to send it out in many different ways. So email, text, we call redundancy, so that let's say if the power is out, but maybe you can still send texts, or if you can send email or maybe flyers, word of mouth, your community best and what will work for your organization. But we're recommending that you write that out ahead of time so that you don't have to basically reinvent the wheel when something happens. The next thing you'll include in your emergency action plan, everyone mentioned fire as one of the most important emergencies. And that includes your own fire safety plan in your organization. That is not New York City emergency management specialty, but you should review that as a part of your emergency plan and reach out to the fire department for more information on how to do that. But it's important that you include that in your emergency plan, how you evacuate, and what fire safety information you should give to your employees. The third thing, and I don't think we've mentioned this yet, is around records. So we know that, especially for organizations, we mentioned mental health, we've mentioned providing counseling to people. I know if you're part of a faith-based group, you probably have things like maybe baptismal records or marriage certificates, things like that. You want to make sure that those are safe so that if something happens to your organization, you do not lose that important information. That can be one of the most devastating parts of an emergency for a small organization. We recommend having them in multiple locations, making sure that they're in waterproof containers if it's a physical file raised where it cannot be affected by a flood. We also recommend using either a cloud-based system or digitizing your records so that you can have duplicates, so that if something does happen, you have a way to retrieve them. That will make your recovery from an emergency a lot easier. I want to stop there to ask if does anyone have any questions about creating an emergency plan before we go into what you can expect after an emergency? Okay. Feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A box. Next, we're going to talk about what you can expect after an emergency. So basically, once something happens, what are some common things that we, emergency management, has seen across New York City happens to organizations, and how can you avoid those things from happening? And before I go to that, I do see that we have a question from Laura about digitizing records. So I'm gonna and so her question is, how are people expected to retrieve digitized records in the event of flooding that may have damaged the systems, computers, etc.? That's a good point, which is that, flooding can damage a computer. And so what I'd recommend is that that's why you would want to have more than one. It's good to keep records in more than one location so that if, let's say, you have a flood at your organization that damages the computer or the server, whatever you have your information on, that they're located in a second place so that if one is destroyed, you have another one. So yes, a digitized record is still susceptible to damage, but if you have that, it's easier to create a second copy of it, essentially. Also, now what a lot of people do is clouds. So use putting things onto a cloud so that you can access it through the internet. Of course, cybersecurity becomes an issue there, but that's another thing a lot of organizations do. So based on the experience we've seen with a lot of small nonprofits and faith-based organizations across the city, we have noticed a few things that come up for organizations. The first is volunteer management. Either by raising your hand or by putting in the chat, does anyone here rely on volunteers to keep their organization running? Great, thank you. So I know that we definitely do. I see a few organizations, and I know a lot of organizations indirectly also manage volunteers or depend on them in different ways. We also have people who distribute food, which we know is a huge way that volunteers help throughout New York City. And so what we've seen is that trouble with staffing, and particularly volunteers, is a common occurrence during an emergency. There are two types of volunteers. There are affiliated ones and unaffiliated ones. Affiliated means you know them, they do a function for you, they're trained. These are people who are part of your organization. So, for example, if you're a part of a religious diocese, for example, maybe the Catholic Church, they have a large pool of volunteers who volunteer on a regular basis and perform a certain function. Unaffiliated volunteers are people who just show up and they want to help, but they might not be trained and you might not know them. And so these are the two types of volunteers that you want to think about in your emergency planning efforts. Affiliated volunteers, which goes with that staffing piece of how would you get more volunteers if you needed them, or how would you respond to your own volunteers? And I'll give you an example. A lot of food bank organizations depend on volunteers. And during the pandemic, they were unable to use those volunteers. And so basically what you'd want to do is have a plan for what happens if the volunteers we rely on are unable to perform their duties. The second one is unaffiliated volunteers. And what happens sometimes is that a large pool of volunteers will show up unannounced and want to help. And so sometimes a small organization can be inundated with people. For example, organizations after Sandy, a lot of them, people knew, oh, well, that organization serves the neighborhood. And so we're just going to show up and help them. This can become a huge problem for you. And so to counteract that, it's good to plan for what you'll do if a lot of people show up wanting to help. I'll put in a resource in the chat, which is nyc.gov/help-now, which is the city's resource for how to deal with volunteers, and particularly if you have spontaneous volunteers, how you might be able to direct them to a more useful project. Of course, the other side of volunteer management is donations management. Does anyone manage manage donations on a regular basis? Great. I know a lot of churches do. And even if you don't, ask for them, they will come. So the two types of donations are solicited donations. So those are things you ask for. For example, Frank has food donations. So you put out, we're looking for food donations for our food bank, and then people give you food. That is a solicited donation. An unsolicited donation is something you didn't ask for. So for example, Laura was saying our churches receive donations weekly. I know a lot of churches are very familiar with people dropping off all sorts of things on their front steps that they want to get rid of, and they think it would be helpful if I gave my wedding dress to the local church so they can give it to someone. So they'll just put it basically wherever donations are being collected. And so this becomes in emergency management what we call the second disaster, which is that as an organization, you could be tasked after an emergency with dealing with a very large amount of donations. We do have resources for help with that on nyc.gov/help-now, but it's something that we like to create awareness around ahead of emergencies because this is a common problem that people come across. This picture is from a fire in the Bronx that affected just a few families, and people showed up to help and dropped off many, many, many tons of clothing for just a couple families that was basically unusable and not needed by them. And so this is the situation that we like to try to avoid through messaging. So having a message that asks people not to send unsolicited donations can prevent them. But we always say, even if you say that, some people will still do it. So it's important to have a plan for what you could do with unsolicited donations. So that's a great question. So what kind of emergency is it where unsolicited and sometimes unnecessary donations arrive? This particular example was from a fire, but I can say that almost any emergency this happens. The ones where it happens the most, I'd say, are ones that are in the media. So if something has a lot of media coverage, particularly if it's geographically specific in one neighborhood, people will send things, but it can be really any kind of emergency, especially one that's really has a lot of publicity around it. Um, oh, sorry. No, there's no specific name for it. We called it the second disaster, which just means it becomes its own emergency, basically dealing with that much stuff. One example is after Hurricane Sandy, people donated all kinds of clothing that was unusable because it was very cold after the emergency and it was becoming, the fall. That's an example of unsolicited donations. The last thing we're going to talk about is something you shouldn't think about before I do want to get to a scenario, is recovery grant management. This is really pertinent. As I said earlier, recovery grants for both COVID have become, there's a lot of grants out there for COVID recovery, but also for IDA recovery. FEMA does have the public and individual assistance active in New York City. So this is not theoretical. This is something that is relevant right now, which is that when an emergency happens as an organization, you are potentially, um, you could potentially be reimbursed for repairing, replacing, or for any services you provide to the victims of an emergency. So for example, if your church was damaged by IDA and you spent money to repair or replace items that you lost, you could potentially be reimbursed by the federal government for things that you lost. Same thing if you provided any services to people who were affected by an emergency. What we say is you cannot be reimbursed for things that you do not have, that you have not kept track of. And so something that's really important is to keep track of everything that you're spending so that you can make sure if something does happen down the line where you could potentially be reimbursed, that you would be eligible. We also recommend getting in touch, basically keeping in touch with organizations that provide grants or potential reimbursement like FEMA, getting to know them before an emergency happens so that you're on their email list, so that you find out what's happening in anticipation of that money that always comes out after an emergency. And this is again something you'd want to work with your finance or fiscal agent, basically on how you could become eligible for funds and making sure that you have everything on your organization side to make you eligible for funds. One thing that also I would note on this is that if you have grants already, so let's say you received a grant to do feeding, if there's an emergency, we talked about prioritizing services. You want to make sure that you prioritize those grants so that you can continue to provide the services that those grants require. even after an emergency. Often, an emergency could be the end of an organization because they're not able to financially recover from it. One example of this is if you're not able to provide your services, then that grant funding tied to those services could potentially go away. Or if you spend too much money repairing or replacing, or if you spend too much money responding to an emergency, sometimes an organization can become stretched too thin and is not able to meet its obligations. And so we really recommend documenting everything and prioritizing services and prioritizing things that make sure that you can continue to receive funding from your grantees. We definitely recommend including your funders in this conversation on how you could respond to an emergency. I want to stop there and just ask, are there any questions before we move on? Okay. I also see that it is 2 o'clock. This is scheduled to go until 2:30. So I want to acknowledge that. And I understand if some people do have to leave for 2 o'clock. We're going to send out the recording so you can always watch it later. But I do want to note that some people probably have to leave. So the scenario on the screen, I'm going to read it out loud. And then if you would like to just say how you would personally respond to this emergency, if we could just get a few folks just talking about how they would start to respond and what they would want to plan. So there is an explosion in your neighborhood and a large fire breaks out in several residential buildings. The fire has spread to several blocks and the scene is blocked off by emergency responders. Residents are displaced. Electric, gas, and water have been cut off for several hundred apartments and small businesses, including your organization. Emergency personnel have not provided an estimated time for utility restoration and say it could take several days. And in the hours after the explosion, people begin to drop off donations and people who want to help start to arrive. So for your organization, what would you do in this situation, or what are some things that you would be thinking about so that you could continue to provide services? So the first answer we have is first assess what was the need. So who is in need in this situation? That's a great place to start. We do other trainings on how to do a needs assessment. That's something that you could do first to get a sense of what do people need and how can we respond effectively. Anesta said communication to my staff and congregants. That's a great place to start as well. That's personally at emergency management what we do. First, we send out a survey to staff members to make sure that they're okay. And that communication to my staff also is the start of thinking about staffing, right? So who's able to come to work to help us respond to this emergency? and who has been affected. Is there any other things that come to mind as things that you would do to respond to this emergency right away? That's a great response. So is it time to go back and review your action plan? Yes. So this is why you created your plan, right? So this would be the time to basically take it out and start to use it. So starting with what are our most important services and what do we have to do to restore them? So if your organization doesn't have your utilities, or if you're having staffing challenges because of this emergency, basically what, based on our plan, do we have to do? One thing to note too is that maybe there's things that happen that aren't in your plan, right? Like you never thought about what happens if our clients are displaced. So you might have to go outside of your plan, but starting with that is a great way to start. Speaking to our emergency management team, activating our action plan, discharge our patients who live locally, giving them 96 hours supply of medication and a copy of their medical records. Thanks. So you can see, particularly in a medical organization, they do this all the time. I will say, I've seen what the East Harlem Co-ed does. Having a medical organization connected to you can be a really good way also to get awesome tips on how to do emergency planning or response, like that one. I want to be sensitive of time, but this scenario is going to be given to you with a list of questions that you could do. So this is something you could practice with your planning team. Practicing this scenario is definitely a good way to make sure that your plan is up to date. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this presentation is community resiliency, and that it goes beyond continuity of operations planning traditionally. So this is what can you do with your community? If your organization has a great plan, that's amazing. But what we've also seen across New York City is that the more connected you are to other organizations in the neighborhood, the more likely you are to be successful in your emergency response. So community resiliency, the collective ability of a neighborhood or geographically defined area to deal with stressors and resume life through cooperation following shocks. That's an academic way of saying if people know each other, they are more likely to respond. So if you're connected to other organizations in your neighborhood, you will be more successful in responding to an emergency and to recovering from it. To help with this, we have created the Community Emergency Planning Toolkit for NYC community and faith-based networks. We can send out a link to this. I think it's at nyc.gov/community preparedness. But we created this toolkit to walk you through the process of creating a network of other organizations that you could depend upon. This is the concept of mutual aid. I know we have one mutual aid network in the training today. So this idea is that if you know what's in the community, you could potentially recover more quickly from an emergency. I could give a million examples of how this works, and I would love to. We do have a mapping workshop coming up on Thursday where we're going to go really in depth on this topic. But we encourage everyone to connect with other community-based organizations as a part of your continuity of operations planning so that, let's say you need food or you need, maybe your clients suddenly need mental health services. if you know who's in the neighborhood, you can connect them to those services. And the idea would be to create a community emergency network, a network of organizations that work with each other during an emergency. So an example of that is the East Harlem Co-ed, a group of organizations that depend on each other during emergencies and do emergency preparedness work to help everyone get prepared. Like I mentioned earlier, being connected to other organizations that have an emergency plan will make you better at having an emergency plan. So particularly those medical organizations can really be helpful. And just some possible partners that you could work with: a disability advocacy group, civic associations, your community board, faith-based immigrant groups, human rights, tenants, co-eds, community organizations active in disaster, your local CERT team. Shout out to all the CERT members here today. And of course, city government, we are here to help you. And the more connected you are in your neighborhood, the more likely your organization is to respond and recover from an emergency. Does anyone have key takeaways from the presentation that they think they'll take away to include in their emergency plan, or things that stuck out to you? Great, thanks. Yes, so getting a plan in place, of course, is important, and it doesn't need to be perfect. The idea of an emergency plan is that you make it better every time something happens based on what happened. And so it's really important to get started. It doesn't need to cost money, and it's important to plan now, of course. Also, we'd say any form of planning you do is better than nothing. It's better to have some form of a plan just to get started, and it doesn't need to be. I know a lot of your organizations probably only have a few people working on this, and so it doesn't need to be a huge effort. Funding requirement, grant management, and what to do before and after. Yeah. Yes, funding is something that people don't often think about in their emergency plan at the start, but it can be one of the most important things you do. Thanks, everyone. So the next steps: one, schedule a Ready New York presentation with us. We would love to come to your organization to teach staff, clients, volunteers, anyone in the community about how to get prepared for an emergency. You can sign up for one of our upcoming trainings. We can provide this training to your organization or any organizations in your neighborhood. And finally, to get alerts from New York City Emergency Management. And you can do that by social media pages, Notify NYC, or the Advanced Warning System. If you Google Advanced Warning System NYC or Notify NYC, you can get emergency alerts from our office. And then the final thing I'll say before we do our question and answer is we have an upcoming National Preparedness Month events. So on Sunday, the Staten Island Children's Museum is free, and we'll have tons of preparedness resources there and things for kids to do. And then our Older Adults Ready Fest will be held in the Bronx next Tuesday. In this webinar series, the upcoming ones are community mapping workshops. So if you're interested in connecting to what's in your neighborhood, and our disabilities access and functional needs training. So how can you be responsive to the needs of people with disabilities? I'll be leading that one next week. And you can sign up for any of those events at nyc.gov/npm. Yes, all Eastern Standard Time. Thanks everyone for coming and bearing with us. As I said, usually we split this between two people. So of course I've been speaking for the full hour, but thanks everyone for joining, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.